No pressure there then. We'll have to try and do as well as we can. I've got the privilege, which I think none of you have had yet, of reading this book. I commend it to you, otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here, but it's a very good read. It's a read with some passion, some personal history, a global perspective, and I think quite a challenging read as well. So I wanted to start by asking Danny why you wrote it. What made you think that this slogan at this time, a slogan some of us remember from way, way back, has been resurrected and you've put your name to it in this way?
Thank you. Thanks, Julia, for agreeing to do this In Conversation event, and thank you all for coming. Someone said, am I nervous? And I am, because I don't think I've ever spoken to an audience which contains my children, my parents, my wife, my chair, and maybe even some of my former trustees, and definitely some neighbours. So
they all know a lot about you.
They do, and I can't do that familiar thing where I can sort of say, one thing about one group, knowing, but... So the book was supposed to be written as I came to the end of my 6 years working at Civicus, the Global Civil Society Alliance, back in 2019. I was going to take a year off to write a book about what was happening to civil society. And I suspect most people in the room don't need reminding about this, but what's going on almost everywhere in the world is horrendous. The sort of rights and freedoms that each of us have or should have to assemble, to associate, to express ourselves, to speak truth to power, those rights and freedoms are being curbed by authoritarians, sometimes elected authoritarians, sometimes even in relatively mature democracies like the one we are in today. And so the original book was going to be about what's happening to civil society, to civic freedoms around the world. And then I had a little detour where I spent 5 years at a wonderful organization called Oxfam Great Britain. And this book is a slightly reworked version, a lot more personal, as you say. So it's a bit more about reflecting on my own journey through civil society and through life. But it's called Power to the People because what started as a book about what's going wrong with civil society has led me on a journey to say, well, actually, it's not that issue about civic freedoms. It's more about how we, as individuals, as citizens, as people, need to reclaim power from an economy that keeps sucking resources out as very extractive, from a political system that isn't particularly good is not particularly dynamic or engaging in engaging us as citizens. And so this is, I think, a very different book from the one that I would have written 5 years ago, and much more about democracy, about society, about community, than it is about civic freedoms as such.
We met when I was chairing an inquiry into the future of civil society, and you were one of the members, and we went around the country listening to what people had to say. And yes, we heard that civil society was in a parlous state, but we also heard that there were no cold spots, that everywhere you go, people are organising and trying to take control of their worlds. And we concluded that we were faced with real issues of power and of trust, the two things that really powered all the way through that inquiry, with our recognition that they were really big concerns. Reading this book, I'm left wondering, what if the people are wrong? All your examples are of people wanting to do things that are more egalitarian, more pro-climate, more anti-climate catastrophe, let me put it that way round, are operating in ways that suit a particular sort of liberal mindset. And yet we know that as we speak, there's a very popular people-led convention going on in the United States, which is saying many things that we wouldn't say. We know that a referendum here that was fought on the slogan, "Take back control," which is not that far from power to the people, has changed things dramatically and has divided people hugely. How do we manage power to the people when actually it can be deeply divisive?
Yeah, thanks. You said that you'd just have some hard questions. I didn't think that would be literally the second one after why did you write this book? Thanks.
I've spotted the audience, they've got harder ones than
yes,
me,
I can, yeah. So it's only a short discussion. We're going to go straight to drinks in 5 minutes. And I'll be signing copies later. No, so there is that danger that the the result of any democratic process is going to inevitably make many of us unhappy, right? And that's the point of democracy. That's about how do we come to terms with difference in political opinion, or you know, how we think society should be shaped or run. And so, in some ways, you know, wrong or right is less important to me than having the mechanisms by which people can decide on particularly thorny or difficult issues, about how we allocate resources, about what actions we take to protect the planet. And my frustration is that we've almost been told that this is as good as it gets in terms of democracy or democratic participation, that somehow representative democracy in a bicameral system with one unelected chamber is the pinnacle of democratic life. And it's not. And I know there's at least one elected member of our House of Commons here, but there might be others and maybe some peers here as well. So let me say, I'm not necessarily saying that representative democracy is completely broken, but I do think, for example, that it's not good enough, I think, for today's day and age, that sort of democratic life is sort of, or the epitome of democratic life is voting every few years in a first-past-the-post system that hardly allows us to express our true democratic preferences, and in a political system where the mainstream choices look increasingly similar. And so that, in some ways, is why we're getting the sorts of movements and backlashes that we're getting in many parts of the world, because people fear, or people feel, that the current system of electoral democracy is not representing their views. It's controlled by elites. It's not accountable to people. And the sort of one argument that runs through the book is we can imagine a better system. And in fact, there are countless examples where there is innovation and experimentation going on to make democracy more deliberative, more participatory, more liquid, more everyday. And so assuming that this is all that, this is the be-all and end-all of what democracy should be like, I think is problematic, and we need to sort of chip away at those assumptions, particularly because the sort of democratic institutions that we rely on to express our collective will today in this country, for example, are in some ways the product of a trade-off that happened a few hundred years ago between aristocrats to see how they could have a system that maintained some elements of their power. And the word democracy wasn't used when many of the institutions we today call democratic were created. It was really a sort of slight tweaks to the system to allow there to be representative or electoral democracy. But if you think forward to the rest of this century, I think we have to think about far more deliberative, far more participatory mechanisms through which collective will is expressed. Sometimes, yes, there are going to be decisions or implications that will make us uncomfortable, but I think it's better to have those difficult conversations in a more participatory way than in the rather fragmented and inadequate way that we have today.
I mean, I'd agree with that, and we've argued, many of us, for a long time, that good representative democracy needs strong participative democracy. Otherwise, it is just put your cross in a box and wash your hands of it. But participatory democracy needs a huge amount of support for it to work well. And in the UK, and in most of the global north, we would describe that as being managed through civil society. When I was chairing the inquiry, you and I were often asked this question: why is civil society so uncivil? And my argument has always been because people join things because they're angry, they want to make things change. They're doing things because it's not good enough. You don't get tenants on a housing estate coming out on a wet Wednesday because there's nothing good on Netflix. They come out because they're absolutely furious and want things to change. They're then in conflict with other people who want other things to change. So from your huge experience in this, tell us a bit more about how, at that very granular level, participatory democracy works.
So I think, the point you make about the sort of diversity of civil society, that, that bits of civil society not only sort of disagree with each other, but have very different worldviews, to me is a good thing, is exactly what we should celebrate, because the strength of civil society lies in its diversity. And what we want is for people to, follow their passion. If they're angry about something, organize and mobilize. If they want to fix something in their community, come together with others and take action. And I think that sort of vibrant undergrowth, if you will, the sort of mycelial network, I use the mushroom analogy in the book, is so precious, right? And we neglect that in some ways, because if you think, how many column inches are written about politics, in terms of elections and the electoral drama, how many column inches are written about business and, what stocks are going up or down, and compare that to how many column inches are written about civic life, about the sort of things that we all do together in communities, not necessarily just when we're angry, but just when we want to connect and heal and fix things. It's a huge it's certainly not a level playing field. And in some, the civicus definition of civil society is the arena in which we as individuals, the arena in which outside the market and outside the state, we as individuals connect to solve collective issues, right? And in some ways, if you say that modern society has these three sectors, and that's why we're sometimes called the third sector, we often neglect this bit of society without which, we wouldn't function. We're social animals. We need each other, and we connect in these fabulous ways outside the market. As in we're doing things not just for profit, and outside the state, not just because we're compelled to do it or there's a sort of law that says we can or cannot do something, and yet we neglect it. And then in Anglo-Saxon countries, and I know you worry about this as much as I do, there's this peculiar construction of civil society as charity, right? Because for 400 odd years we had our Charities Act, and where there are these entities in society that are supposed to be there to do good. You're a registered charity to do good. And that, by implication, means that the bits of civil society that are angry, that are campaigning, that are speaking truth to power, that are challenging norms, are often demonized or made to look as if they're problematic, that they're anti-democratic, and they're not what good charity should be doing. And that, I do think, is something we have to challenge, because those bits of civil society feel really precious and important. And if we don't protect those fundamental freedoms and rights and challenge the notion that there is sort of good civil society and bad civil society, we're lost.
Absolutely. And what matters is that we recognise those tensions are what makes it good. I think of civil society as the bedrock. The state would not function in any sense, either locally or nationally, without civil society. And by and large, the market wouldn't very well either, because the dependence on what happens in communities matters so much. I'm going to throw this open to everybody. I've got one more difficult question for him, and then I'm going to ask the rest of you to do it. The same thing. What about people who just want to lead their lives? This is the call to action for us all to care hugely about what's happening. And I suspect people around in this room have spent most of their lives caring about things and coming to them. Lots of people don't. They want what the English Housing Act calls quiet enjoyment in their homes, which is worth fighting for. A sense that around them things will go on. And we put a huge amount of pressure on people to get involved. What do you say to people who think, actually, my life is my family, my neighbours, where I live. The rest of it is not my responsibility?
I'd say two things. I think almost all of us, I would argue, or probably every one of us, I would argue, does something that is a manifestation of civil society, right? So getting involved in those things that we might not currently call civil society or is not part of formalized civil society is incredibly important. So that bit of the undergrowth we're all part of, and we should be intentional about it and recognize it and celebrate it, value it as a society more than we currently do. So I think that's really important. And secondly, yes, we can't compel people to get active, although I grew up in Australia where it's compulsory to vote. And it's, I think that's not a bad thing. Why doesn't democratic life come with responsibilities, including the responsibility to vote? But the second point I would make is there's a chapter in here about democratizing our economies. I was going to call it "The Rest Is Not Just Politics," because if we're going to fix democracy, we're going to have to fix our economy. And we live in a society which is getting unequal at eye-watering rates, right? The levels of wealth accumulation are happening at the same time that levels of precariousness, of insecurity for the vast majority of people who are, doing gig economy jobs or working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet, mean that inevitably huge proportions of our society here and huge proportions of the world population just don't have the time to be as active as they would like to be and need to be for healthy functioning democracies or society. And so in some ways we do need to pay attention to the sort of deep injustice of how our economy works and provide some of us with sort of, untold amounts of leisure time to go and enjoy our yachts while huge proportions and increasing proportions of our society just don't have time to be able to live fulfilling democratic lives.
And I thought that chapter about how we democratise the economy was incredibly powerful for its messages from all over the world about the steps people are taking, which, like so much that happens like this, is often seen as small and partial and only at the edges. And it's actually game-changing in the way you've described it. Right, I've promised other people will have a go. Questions or comments, and I know you haven't had the privilege of reading it, but you have had the privilege of listening to him. I can't see everybody, so I'm just going to point at you there. And I don't know if there's a mic or if you could just talk very loudly. A mic may be on its way, but if it isn't, just talk loudly.
So there's the economy, and then there's the state politics, but then there's also the money itself. And at the moment we have governments that can control the basic money supply within that's going around of dollars or pounds, and they print more or whatever. That changes the game completely because they have all the power, really. What do you get excited about? Decentralized finance, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, and the fact that these could go beyond borders, beyond states. They could become almost network states in their own right around certain issues and can be focused around public goods. And I'm not a total expert on this, but I feel it's a direction that could give a lot more power to the people. When we say money is power, well, then we also need to change money itself, not just the economy.
I told you to get some difficult questions, much worse than mine. That's a hard one. And you do cover some of it here.
I do, thank you. So yes, the relationship between money and power is one that we urgently need to interrogate, because part of what is going on is there's sort of willful negligence about the role of money in politics, and the sort of this almost innocent assumption that we've made that of course it'll all be fine. We will all have one vote in an equal vote in a democracy, and it just doesn't work that way. Wherever you look, whether it's the way that political parties are financed or whether there's a sort of the increasing corruption in the way that procurement is being done in this country, and there are some examples about how that collusion between political and economic power is undermining democracy. And again, comes back to the sort of, partly to your earlier question, Julia, about how will this end? I mean, we have such low levels of trust in politicians already. Max? Yeah. Only 7% of the British people think that our elected officials act in the interests of the country. That's, a fraction of what it was even 20, 30 years ago. And so we need to do something to restore trust in all sorts of institutions, but particularly political institutions. But you mentioned DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. I do talk a bit about them because they're not entirely problem-free. There are some challenges around how governance and participation works in these spaces. But I use them as examples of how, if we put our mind to it, we can create far more participatory institutions across society than the ones we currently have. So, we assume that organizations in society, whether they're businesses or charities or even state or parastatal institutions, need to be structured in a sort of particularly hierarchical way, that we need to have owners or trustees or whatever else it is. But I think the digital world does open up the possibility in radically overhauling the way that governance works. So decentralized autonomous organizations are one example of how you can structure on an open ledger or blockchain way organizations so that even in the sort of inherent nature of the organization, how it's structured in a far more democratic or participatory and certainly far more transparent way. And again, this is not a magic bullet, it's not the be-all and end-all, and it comes with some challenges, but it's an example of how we shouldn't take the current institutions that we've inherited as if that is the best we can do, because there is an opportunity, I think, to radically innovate. And to your point about cross-border, why we continue to assume that societal formations are going to be bounded by the nation state when the sort of digital world is wreaking havoc on all of that, I don't know. I mean, there's a bit in here, I talk about citizenship and the innovations that are already happening. Palau, the island in the Pacific, is already offering digital citizenship for people for, I think it's like $250,000 US dollars. So you can be physically resident somewhere, anywhere in the world, but your digital citizenship in the metaverse you can buy in Palau, which will have a low tax regime for your digital activities. And so, the world is changing radically, but we're relying on these very tired and creaking assumptions about how institutions should work.
The thing you bring out in the book a lot, and I think it picks up this question, is both the speed of change and the essential nature of trust. I mean, the Prime Minister, responding to the King's speech, said that today, didn't he? It is the currency that we value most, and it is the currency that's most at risk. And the speed of change in the way you've described it, I don't think only makes me feel a bit nervous about what that does to trust, because following it and reading this makes you realize quite how quickly things are coming at us. So digital citizenship, I had to really concentrate on that. There's somebody here, and there's a mic on its way to you.
Well, congratulations, Danny. Really looking forward to reading it. And I know one of the issues you've struggled with all your working life are the inequalities within civil society itself, and in particular between organisations working on the international sphere, between the North and the South. And I wondered if you had any insights to share about where your thinking is on where that's going.
Thank you, Harriet. I need to read your book. I should encourage people to read your book. On exactly this issue. So I think two observations there. I think, yes, there are inequities and growing inequalities within civil society. If you just take this country, between the better resourced charities, the big household brands that have lots of resources, and smaller, newer, informal bits of civil society that rely almost entirely on voluntary action. And I think those two sort of poles, or sort of these bits of civil society, haven't been nearly as good as they need to be in working together. That we need to be supporting and nurturing solidarity across those. Those are bits of civil society that do have resources, and I've been fortunate to work for some of those organizations, I think have a positive obligation to work in a more solidaristic way with those smaller, less well-resourced, but playing to each other's strength, because it does help to, if you work for a household name charity, that comes with a certain cachet and influence. It opens doors. That's really important for civil society to have bits like that. Just as important it is to have informal social movements that can pop up and capture the public imagination about an issue that people are angry about. But those bits of civil society need to get better at working together. And then your point about North and South, I think there is it relates to sort of new global formations. So many of the connective bits of civil society that cross borders feel very outdated. If you think about those international charities, that we know of. Many of them were created in the last century. Many of them are headquartered in places like the UK. Many of them collect resources in places like the UK, and sometimes end up acting in a sort of neo-colonial way, that they're there to sort of collect money from rich donors here and help needy beneficiaries over there. And I think we need to do better. We need to build solidarity in a much better, more equal way, and create new connective tissue that can connect and bind us as citizens, that don't replicate some of those old power structures from the 20th century. So I think there is, and I don't know what the right answer is, but I think we need to be asking, can we create new networks that live up to 21st century values of solidarity and equality, rather than rely on some outdated formations?
But it is true, isn't it, in all sectors, that the tension between institutions and movements and networks is huge. I mean, in what we liberally call the corporate sector, eBay and Uber and all of those, Airbnb, have destabilised, as have the fintechs in the financial services sector. So I think we're all going through the same journey, it's just we manage it so differently. And I think there's been a fear within civil society and perhaps a fear in political circles about what does this mean? Because the institutions are the things we recognise and understand, even if we don't like them. The movements and networks can be scary and play by different rules, but actually that's part of what they're there to do. Paul, you had the microphone.
Danny, I wanted to ask you a question about like the centerpiece announcement in the King's speech today about planning reform. Because I think this is one of the biggest conundrums that I must confess that I'm very ambivalent about. On the one hand, you want to devolve power closest to the people as you possibly can. On the other hand, anything of consequence that we have to get done at scale on climate requires taking power away from NIMBYs. So you're not going to get grids, you're not going to get data centers, you're not going to build houses for people if you give wonderful, well-heeled constituencies more interested in preserving the green belt than doing things potentially in the collective interest. And so, you know, this seems to be an example of where we're going to actually, at a national level, take power away from local communities and the collective benefit, but it's sort of, the kind of radical Democrats amongst us are conflicted by that, even though I probably come down on the, you know, let's get big things done in a centralized way at this moment in history. But how do we sort that out in Danny world?
We were talking about this just before, weren't we? This is a massive tension.
Danny world?
Danny world.
I like that. That's the next book.
Playing to his ego. Go on, answer the question.
Gosh. So, I mean, I'd challenge one thing you said about that. So, yes, there are going to be some people in some constituencies who are going to be very upset that a national directive is going to sort of stampede over their wish to protect this or not build that or whatever else it is. But there'll be other people in the same constituency who say, thank goodness this is finally happening because this is for the, you know, ultimately for the better of society. So, you know, in some ways, the challenge, as always for democracy, is how do we find mechanisms to make sure that those who, you know, are opposed to a decision are sufficiently bought in to respect the majority view or and that comes, so we're all inevitably going to have challenges or disagreements, but I think the current mechanisms that we have to resolve them are deeply problematic. So if you know, take this last general election, 19 million of us didn't vote. That's about double the number of people who actually voted for the Labour Party. Right? So we had 40% of the electorate choosing not to vote or deciding not to vote, almost the highest in the last century since we've had near universal suffrage. And then add to that those people who voted reform, for example, because they were fed up with mainstream parties, those people who did tactical voting in a first-past-the-post system that's almost the least imaginative way that we can express our democratic thing. And I grew up in Australia where we have very sophisticated alternative voting systems. I'm happy to talk about, there's a couple of pages devoted to them. But so there are ways in which we can even restore, I think by increasing trust and faith in what national government is doing, that'll help. But secondly, there are deliberative ways that are being trialed all around the world to resolve those thorny issues, even at the most local level, right? So citizens' assemblies, many of you will be familiar with. There are a few hundred now that have been used across the world, and there are now studies and lessons about how you do that. So, you know, take a thorny issue in which society or a community is divided, and find ways in which people can have meaningful dialogue, can learn to disagree with each other and move forward, and not rely on things like referenda. You know, in some ways we might think, oh, referenda are fabulous ways of creating, you know, of giving voice to what the people want or think, and yes, in some ways they are. But we've had lesson after lesson where referendums have left a society more divided because a reductive vote at the national level in an abstract way with few facts and little evidence, and sometimes just crude lies, do more damage to society than a more deliberative process. And there's some fantastic examples in the book of where countries or societies have used, say, citizens' assemblies not only to resolve an issue, but build that trust about the outcome. So I think that we need to look for those sorts of mechanisms and renew democracy in that way.
But I think I'd add to that, we mustn't forget that there are really big material differences about what people want. So I spent a lot of my working life in housing. People who don't want housing built in a particular place really don't want it built there. And they have a right to be heard too. On the other hand, people need to be housed. I always remember hearing from Ipsos Mori, if you ask people in somewhere, do you want housing built here? They say no. So do you want housing built here so the children can stay? And they say yes. We have got to find a different way of having that really complex conversation. And that's true on lots of other issues. Sue, here, can we have a mic down here? I don't know who's... Oh, there you are. I'd lost you behind the pillar. And then I'll come to you.
Thank you. And congrats, Danny. I can't wait to read the book. Having not read it, this may not be right, but from what you're talking about, it sounds that the book is in large part about democratic renewal and making our system of government more representative, participative and so on. As you know, the work that I'm involved in is about trying to unleash civil society's potential to drive change, often outside of government, or build the pressure so that governments can actually take more radical progressive action. And like a lot of people, I'm sure, at the last election, I spent most days arguing with my now adult children about Labour and that they could be a force for good because they just can't see it. And I'm, saying you don't understand the narrow path they're trying to go down to get into government. Caroline didn't come together today, but we wrote a report on democratic space last year, trying to point out its value and importance and highlight the fact that there's virtually no funding goes into civil society to defend itself. That didn't convert to much change. So my two questions for you really are, in doing this work on the ground, as it were, the thing that I just come up against a lot is, as you referenced, the association with charity is really problematic in the UK. It really keeps us in this deeply Victorian mode. But so much of our sector is in that place, including funders, and it is, I think, intentionally apolitical. And I don't see that changing, and it's wearing. And I was going to, I guess in the absence of that, it is so hard to then build a field. There's an absence of a field around this work that similarly makes it very, very difficult. And the same is true in academia. And if there's not a field in academia, you can sort of assume there won't be one in the real world either. So those are my two questions for you. How can we build a field? And how can we get funders behind this in the UK in the way they are in the States, for example? Can you sort that out, Danny?
Whereas in the States, of course, big funders have been hugely intentional in building up the far right in the United States. There's been a very big and long program of work funding, internships at Fox News for 40 years to make sure that there is that body of intellectual thinking and ability. And there are significant organizations. We haven't had that here, thank God. But there are other ways in which we perhaps don't want to always follow that because that's been highly politicized. I think it's had a really interesting impact, but it's worth exploring. I'll pass to Danny, whose book it is, not mine.
But this is in conversation, so it's fine.
We're allowed to do that, we?
Yeah. So part of the book is a plea to against the sort of complacency that I see, particularly in a country like this, where the assumption is we're a mature, robust democracy, what can go wrong? And in some ways, mainstream actors, whether they're big charities, small charities, donors, are simply sort of just assuming that things will be fine. And my worry is that they won't. There's an increasing chance that, whether you look at the economy or the current democratic structures, we're, potentially at breaking point, and we need to do something about that. And so I think that's the sort of plea to everyday citizens to say, we've got a collective responsibility to fix this, and each of us needs to play a part, maybe even be compelled to play a part occasionally.
Yeah, I'm not against that.
But similarly to donors, like saying, a little bit of philanthropy here and there, from your massive wealth that you've accumulated to sort of fix this thing or that thing isn't good enough, right? We need to challenge philanthropists to build a better world. And the reason I'm hopeful is if you ask me, do I trust government, business, or civil society to come up with the solutions of tomorrow, the institutions of tomorrow, the to plot a better future, I'd put my money on civil society, because I think it's those creative ideas, those countercultural ideas, have more often than not come from citizens coming together and say, actually, we're fed up with the fact that women can't vote, or that black people in America don't have the same rights as white people, or that there is a climate emergency. And so whether you're Emmeline Pankhurst outside Parliament protesting, or Rosa Parks refusing to give up your seat when the driver tells you to move, or Greta Thunberg sitting outside her school, these are all people who dared to dream of a very different future, and then often took huge risk, or sometimes not much risk, but still decided that they had a stake in that future. And I think sort of maybe the best way to I suppose that's the point of writing this book, because it's written for many people who are not in this room, who aren't experts in civil society, who aren't steeped in civil society. This is in some ways a plea to say, we have to wake up and not take for granted some of what we've been told about how politics needs to work or how the economy needs to work. And that is as much a plea to donors and others who nurture and support civil society.
And indeed, in the history of this country and the Anglo-Saxon world, it is the big pivotal moments in history that have created new sorts of civil society. You can, in the UK, map when organisations were formed after the Industrial Revolution, after the First World War, Second World War, the identity politics of the 60s and 70s. You can see that movement. And I think we should be proud of it, because it was a response. But whether it had enough impact is a whole other question. Somebody over there, I think.
Congratulations on the book, Danny. I'm interested in what you were just saying, actually, there, just all the women that you mentioned who took great risks, because you've talked about trust, you've talked about power, but risk aversion is so high right now. People's appetite to take risk, whether individually, the government, the private sector. So does your book speak about how we can really address that third part in order to bring about some of these new and creative ways in which we can activate people power?
The third part being risk aversion.
Yes. Yeah. How scared we've all become, I think.
Pretty much.
Yeah, I suppose the easiest way to answer that is to come back to the sort of undergrowth, the mycelial network, right? So those people, all those three people I just mentioned, yes, did take risks. But what's important, and I think the lesson I draw, is that they were part of something bigger. So let's take Rosa Parks, for example, who was in her 40s, was a seamstress, was returning home, tired from work, when all the sort of white seats on the bus in Montgomery were full, and she was told to move from her seat by the driver to vacate her seat for a white person, and she refused to get up. She was arrested. She was then put on trial, and trial took many, many months to come. And we think, wow, that's brave. She took a risk. She lost her job. Her husband lost a job, right? But what the story that fascinates me is that many years before Rosa Parks did that, she went to something that's now called the Highlander Centre, which is a sort of a school for civil resistance, for activism. It was one of the few places in Rosa Parks' life until then where she actually met and sat with people, a multiracial group of people, to talk about resistance and how we can change society and imagine a better world. And importantly, she was doing that while there was a legal challenge to segregation laws that was being mounted by civil rights organizations. There was a young pastor in his first job called Martin Luther King, who became very activated and involved, took risks as well. And so the lesson I draw from that example is, yes, we're right to celebrate those people who did take the risks, but we have a collective responsibility to build to nurture the undergrowth that supports that sort of civic activism, and which is why the first one chapter begins with the local football club up the road from where I live on Wandsworth Common, Broomwood Football Club, where there's at least a few active coaches here. And my point is, those people who are getting up on a Saturday morning to coach their kids and are part of Britain's largest voluntary sports football club, that's just as important as the people taking risks to speak truth to power, because those things are inherently connected by the sort of undergrowth of civic life. And if you'd asked me 5 or 6 years ago, I would have focused on the sort of pointier bits. And I think I've come to realize that unless we nurture the undergrowth, those pointy bits will be too risky, to be too outliers, will not be supported by the legal and other tactics that will maximize our chance of success.
I think that's a really compelling argument for why we need links across rather than a distinction between. Because very often all the writing about civil society will talk about the pointy bits and the safe institutions, but actually it's the institutions that enable people to take action. And the Rosa Parks story, which I hadn't heard, is a really compelling one, is that church movements and community organisations had already given her confidence to do that thing we all just think of as hugely iconic and can't believe anyone could be that brave, which is what I tend to see when I think when I see it. Caroline, now can we have a mic here, and then I'll come to you at the back. Sorry, there's a lot of racing around this room, but Caroline's here.
Thank you, and congratulations, Danny, again. My question really is, you've got a vision of how things could be better. Can you describe what the world would look like, if actually this happened? And how would it benefit society? For example, tackling the big challenges. And just to sort of say by a bit of background, that when Sue and I were involved in creating the report Defending Our Democratic Space, a lot of civil society leaders were saying we needed to create a sort of positive vision of how things could be. And not that long ago, when Sue Gray was working for Keir Starmer in opposition, she gave an interview to a newspaper where she talked about the value of citizens' assemblies. And I remember tweeting about this really positively, thinking this was fantastic. And then a sort of, metaphorical ton of bricks fell, from the Labour Party and others. And people were saying, well, this is just reinventing, the Soviet Union. This is disgraceful. And then opposition spokesmen were saying, oh no, this will never happen. We'll never allow this to happen in our country. Which to me sort of illustrated that even though, there are enthusiasts, I'm sure lots of them in this room, for that sort of participative democracy, we haven't really got the story to just why that's modern, different, and valuable.
It's also quite a good example of how isolated and insular we are. I saw your tweet, I hadn't realised you'd had that response. Because actually so many countries are now managing quite a lot of their difficult decision-making. The City of Paris, for one place, are doing things really quite innovatively. And even in terms of referenda, which have a bad name, the Republic of Ireland has marked huge social change by confirmatory referenda. So we have a history of doing it, but yes, I recognise that there's a nervousness.
Well, that example of citizen assembly to me, is a compelling vision of what was an ingredient in a compelling vision of what the future might look like. So today in the King's Speech, apparently there is a plan to do some minor tinkering to the House of Lords, right? So they're going to, I think the Labour Party will get rid of the 91 remaining hereditary peers. I would urge Keir Starmer and Sue Gray, if she believes in citizen assembly, to replace the House of Lords with a House of the People. An upper house that's chosen by sortition or random selection. So there's a representative group of us from society who sit, let's say, for 2-year terms. It'd be like jury duty. If you're employed, your employer has to keep your job open while you serve. And this House of Review would be the sort of permanent citizens' assembly, a deliberative space in which the lower house can ask the upper house to consider thorny issues. So, let's say if we had Brexit all over again, instead of going to a deeply divisive referendum, we would ask the upper house, the House of the People, to consider, for however long it will take, what the best way forward would be. And in doing that, we get rid of the world's second largest legislative chamber, 700 odd people, I think, at last count, and it grows by the day, 7% of whom are former political advisors or party donors. How on earth in the 21st century do we think that not just an unelected second chamber, but one that's full of ex-politicians, party donors and others, is the epitome of democratic life? So for me, a component of the story is to say, we must do better, and we can do better. We claim that this is the sort of Westminster, the mother of all democracies. Maybe Keir Starmer could be the doula for a more sort of deliberative, participatory democracy. And it might, yes, there'll be lots of tons of bricks all over the place. And I did my wife and I were having dinner with a peer only recently in the House of Lords where I did raise this and they got very upset.
They don't like it at all.
And I have nothing, these are amazing. The members of the House of Lords do a fantastic job at present. My point is a second chamber, House of the People, will do a much better job for us in delivering a better, more participatory democracy.
Thank you. I'm just charmed by the idea of Starmer as a doula. It's going to stay in my mind all my way home. There's somebody over there on the left-hand side who I can't see, but I can see a hand. And the mic's on its way to you. So, yes, delivered.
Hi, congratulations on your book, Danny. Can't wait to take a copy home with me today. So my question is about how the meeting of the margins and the mainstream, really. So how can we ensure that, when seldom heard voices are linked to kind of institutions of power, it can happen on their own terms? And I'm kind of thinking that often when those outsider voices are brought in, the expectation is on them to assimilate and learn the codes and adapt and fit into, what's happening in the mainstream, rather than the other way around. So I was just wondering if you had any kind of advice or insights into how we can kind of blend the edges or extend the mainstream to the margins rather than picking people up from the margins and putting them in the mainstream and hoping for the best.
So maybe I'll give you one story from recent lived experience, and that's from Oxfam. And I know there are lots of colleagues here who are on this journey with me in the 5 years I had the privilege of serving at Oxfam. And I use it as an example of an institution that had its share of challenges, particularly around the safeguarding and misconduct issues in Haiti and elsewhere. But when we did the research and looked at the organization, what we found is an organization where people thought, there were good people who knew best. And so, we were the experts, we were going to go and do things, and that led to some deeply unhealthy ways of interacting as an institution with others who we were there to serve. And the deep and difficult, sometimes, process that's ongoing is to rethink the way the institution works. So rather than think of the institution as the holder of power, of resource, of expertise, the process that I think the journey that Oxfam and many other development organizations are on is to sort of reimagine themselves as to put those people that we claim to serve more at the heart of what we're trying to do. And I think it's a difficult journey for institutions because in some ways, the more power you hold, the less likely you are to devolve it or to give it away. And yet that's exactly what we need to do, right? And that's, whether that's institutions like big NGOs or institutions like the House of Lords or the UN, I think the next generation of institutions need to be much better at doing exactly as you say, of interacting with those whose voices are not heard, who don't have power, who challenge the very institutional sort of ethos.
And perhaps I'd go further than that, because this is a very optimistic book. It's that institutions are beginning to, maybe being pushed into thinking that they can't operate without it. It's not a nice to have extra to listen to what's happening at the margins. It's absolutely make or break, because so many institutions have been so flawed by the ways in which people they have excluded in the past are now using their power differently. I mean, you were talking about the internet and the digital world as hugely positive, and it is in many ways. Social media has taught a number of the institutions in this country a very uncomfortable, unhappy lesson. And it hasn't been wrong to do that. It may have been brutal and very unpleasant, but those same institutions are now having to think rather differently. How do we listen to what we used to think were the margins, but actually on which we wholly depend? Now, I had somebody's hand before I started talking. Where there was somebody over here had a hand up, maybe. Yes, I'm sorry, I can't even see you. I just see your hand.
Hello. Thank you, Danny, for the beautiful insight you've given so far. I have a very simple question, but I feel that you might hate it a little bit. What can the people do in the face of decentralized corruption that has managed to infest itself into every single institution that was supposed to be able to protect the people from this corruption? We have found ourselves in a situation where the people who are unorganized are being faced with an evolving corruption that has learned from history, that is using artificial intelligence and multiple different resources just to adapt to the situation and maintain its power. What can the people do against that?
Well, I told you wouldn't get easy questions, but that is profound, and I suspect other people may have responses too, so I'm not going to make it all yours.
Yeah.
Have a go, because it is really important to understand that this is a time of crisis. This is an optimistic book at a time of real threat, which I think is what you've described.
Yeah, well, let me go back to institutional design, because I think that is part of the opportunity here, which is to rethink how the assumptions we make about institutions. So another example, and I presume one of the examples you mean is around, say, how corporate power works. Why is it that we have eye-watering levels of accumulation? How is it that short-term shareholder capitalism has become the sort of dominant form of economic life in a way that would have been unimaginable even a century ago? It's partly because I think we've just assumed that the sort of regulatory functions, the regulatory system that we have will be good enough to guard against, corruption, accumulation, and planetary destruction. And I think there are some, examples where, so for example, there's a campaign called the Better Business Act campaign, which is a simple set of measures to change the way that companies are regulated in this country, but it could happen everywhere, which is to sort of put the onus on directors of companies or shareholders to take ownership of the social and environmental impacts of their activities, the externalities that we're paying a huge price for. It would still mean you could have sort of entrepreneurial functions, capitalist companies or whatever, but there's a positive obligation to be more open and transparent and accountable for your activities. And I think it's that, so it's the sort of, again, this willful negligence. We've assumed that these sort of 19th or 20th century formations are going to be fine, that they will prevent harm, that they will act in, to support the collective good. And wherever I look, there are problems. And so, but the answers, I think, could involve simple regulatory changes to put the onus back on people to report, for example.
You've got a mic, just so everybody can hear you.
Sorry, hi, hello again.
Yeah, that's fine. Much better.
Is regulatory action something that the people are able to implement, or is it more something that the government or the power side that are supposed to be implementing it? And it comes down to the legal system and legal institutions that are also suffering from this corruption. So what actions can the people do knowing that we are faced with this system that is beyond saving?
We can skip the question if it's too hard.
I mean, I spend too much of my life worrying about the nature of regulation, and we haven't got time for me to worry out loud about it. But I think you can see in some models of regulation real social change driven through decades. And in other forms of regulation, we have this, what I describe as phony accountability, which is you report on something and then it doesn't really matter because you report in such a complex way no one can understand. Neither of those approaches are standing up to the power of big data and social media communication. So what's called a glass organization now, that businesses are no longer hidden behind brick walls, everybody can have a look at them, is changing how people talk about regulation. But in this country, look at what the health and safety legislation, which is all regulatory, has done. When I was first working, it was routine for men who'd worked on building sites to always have a finger missing. It was a sort of rite of passage. When that happens now, the directors have to resign. You do not have those sorts of injuries. That was fought for by trade unions, but by others. And it's an architecture of protection that needs to keep up to date, isn't always perfect, but is a form of regulation that was introduced because of very powerful campaigning and has changed the outcome of how we operate as a society. We don't have those sorts of at-work injuries at scale, and if we do, there is pretty hefty penalty. So I think regulation is not as separate as we believe it is from what people demand. Unfortunately, what we've had in lots of areas, particularly regulation of business, and I speak as someone who sat on the Financial Reporting Council for years, so I know this to my cost, is a form of reporting that risks just putting more and more information out there without actually communicating what it's about.
And there is an activist element in the sense, there are, I know at least a few of you in this room work for big corporates, for big banks, for big law firms, right? There's a role for each of you as well. I mean, I think we've been sort of told that we leave our activist at the door when we go to our workplace, right? And we end up being complicit in this system that's deeply worrying, extractive, dangerous. And so there's a role for sort of impatient insiders within these organizations to drive change. There's a role for us as consumers. Think about the sort of
consumers.
Yeah, the power of consumers to choose products that are fair trade foundation endorsed, or that where a real living wage is paid across the supply chain, or wherever else it is. And so there are elements of everyday activism, of being a 24/7 citizen, that will, again, in aggregate, help drive change.
Thank you. And we've got a question here, and then I am going to try and pull this to a close and allow you some closing remarks. So, yes, there. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Started my new job last week. It's going well so far.
Congratulations.
7%.
I've only been criticised deeply for the new profession at one meeting so far, so thanks. I saw the King speak today, by the way. That was interesting.
Yeah.
But then there's a discussion to be had about power there,
Yep.
where there's a man wearing a crown in front of a room of people, half of whom are elected, and some of whom, well, the ones who are elected, actually, really struggle to get in. Anyway, I've digressed slightly. So two questions. The first is that the left and those on the progressive side of politics often say that nationalisation is the solution to solving public service problems, whether it's railways, whether it's healthcare. Does nationalisation bring power closer to the people, or does it take it further away, and does it depend which sector it's in? And the other one is, there was a discussion today about devolution, and what should devolution look like in this country?
Oh, yes. That's a good one to finish on. That's
Yes.
very impressive.
I'm glad you asked about nationalisation, because there is a bit in the bit about democratising our economies. The good news there, and another reason to be hopeful, is the models by which humans have chosen to organise economic activity that we need for the future. The good news is we've done a lot of these things before. So cooperatives, for example, are a vibrant and interesting way in which we can organise economic life. Mutuals are another way in which we can hold collective ownership of public goods. So I would argue, if there's a problem at the post office, and we've had some prominent problems, let's mutualise the post office, which perhaps might be an even better way than nationalising something like that, to give communities ownership. The postmasters and sub-postmasters feel ownership of this sort of public good. And so nationalisation might help, but there are these other mechanisms by which we can put the collective ownership of the commonwealth of public goods, do better than what we've had in the last 30, 40 years, which has been this sort of sinister privatization of our public goods. Devolution is meaningful, and it was sort of, in some ways, my answer to Paul's question earlier, I think sort of helps answer that. But let me use this as a peg to make the other argument, which is a bit that no one's asked about, which is, there's a bit of the equation that is about devolution, of devolving power to communities, to people, so that we all feel more connected to those sort of political decisions, and and don't just trust those people sitting in the House of Commons. But the other bit is the supranational. Right. There's a plea in the book to rethink how democracy might work at a more global level. So many of the fundamental challenges society faces today can only be solved through effective global cooperation and through global mechanisms. And yet, democracy hardly gets a look in at any form of global decision-making. Almost all the big decisions are taken behind closed doors by unelected diplomats who have absolutely no interest in transparency or accountability to those of us who elected the governments that appointed them and put them into those decision makings. Again, we can do better than that. There are ways in which we need to bring more participatory democracy into global decision making as well. So in some ways, I'm saying that there's we need to recalibrate where power is held and sits politically, both up and down, in a sort of geographical sense.
And I'd go further than that and say I think we need to do things at the most local level we realistically can. And some global things we absolutely can't do it locally, but quite a lot in this country and in the States, and indeed in Australia, is held at, in our case, national level or federal level in the States, which doesn't need to be there. And actually the old principle of subsidiarity, of doing things as close to where people live, is in a whole range of activities going to make it more possible to get the sort of buy-in that you need to then allow the global institutions to operate. Danny, you've given your book such interesting conversation has come out of it. I think that what this book does is start us off on a new conversation. We've talked for a very long time in this country about the three sectors, and you do that very eloquently. But we've also talked about, and the Prime Minister did today, about the loss of trust and the danger that poses to us as a society. I think in this book what you've done is challenge all of us to think really differently about it. And before I allow everyone to go and have a drink, you can have a last word, which is a rare moment.
I suppose I did say it was awkward and unusual for me to sit in a room with family and chairs and others. I wanted to say thank you, because this book is as much about a personal story, a reflection on a personal story and how I think I became an activist. And I owe a lot to my parents, who are in the room somewhere, for inspiring me with a sense of obligation and of responsibility and of hope, but also my family, my wife in particular, and my editor and my publisher. Been very helpful, thank you. So the book is
thank you to all of them.
Thank you to all of those. And I think that's the true test. I can't remember whether it was Patrick or Martin who told me to write a book for people who didn't know what the word civil societies or the phrase civil society meant, because those of us who do work in this world end up sort of talking amongst ourselves. And I think the challenge is to sort of remind people who are not in our world about how precious this thing we call citizenship is, and how we need to nurture the undergrowth of civic life if we're going to restore trust, make our economy fairer, solve global challenges. And so, or put in other words, we're going to have zero chance of addressing any of those challenges that worry us in a sustainable world, in a sustainable way, unless we democratize and reimagine the way these things work. And I hope this book helps a little bit.
I think this will be a really important part of the conversation. Thank you for writing it.